Hey everybody, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions, host and executive producer of the Break It Down show. Man, do we have a fantastic episode to close out the week here. Our guest is named Vanessa Otero. She's a patent attorney from Denver, Colorado. She's educated at UCLA, and super smart. Okay, here's what she's done. She's created this powerful assessment tool that looks at news media and gives you an idea of where they are in terms of credibility, political lean, and so it plots them on a map. Now, you've seen a lot of these things. Here's why this one's a little bit different. One, she's got a panel of people across a variety of political settings, and they all sort of self-check each other. They also look at a given story and how it is represented within that publication's lean and legitimacy. So something like Breitbart is less reliable and pretty extremely, far to the right. Not alt-right, but pretty far to the right. Where on the other side, I just learned this today, Slate is comparably aligned, but on the left side, where you're like, more opinion-based and not all that tight with the accuracy, at least not as much as Reuters or AP, which are top dead center, super accurate, very little lean in either direction, and story to story, you see a very small pattern, whereas the other publications tend to be looser. It's just fascinating stuff. My co-host is my former commander from Bosnia. He ran all of us spies, and he said, look, Vanessa's tool is interesting because, of course you can find out for yourself what kind of news you're reading, but also you can understand your adversaries better because he's an intelligence guy. He's a spy master, right? So he's always thinking, how do you evaluate the information that's out there? What is your opponent thinking? And how do we counter that? Because that's what counterintelligence folks do. So I think you're going to find this to be a very fascinating conversation. If you're like me at all, I'm just frustrated with the media and the amount of spin and lean and all these things. And Vanessa just comes straight at it. And I think this is really going to be a fantastic episode that you guys are going to enjoy. Her company is called Adfontes Media, ADFONTES media.com, adfontesmedia.com. And their vision is simply to help people. And they want to help people navigate the news landscape and contribute to a healthy democracy. Well, I'm all in for that. Let's do a little bit of business here. So obviously get shirts, rate the show, review the show, subscribe to the show, convince a friend to subscribe. All of these things help us out. Even if you just text or email or just check in with me, that all helps. The more action there is, but the best thing is sharing. If you share, it helps the computer go, hey, this thing's being shared. This thing is important. I do my best to get them out there. I know that the threads are always battling against us, but that's really what it would be awesome is if you guys could share this episode, especially this one, because it doesn't focus on partisanship. It does help us understand what we're reading and what our friends are reading so we can all say, this is interesting. Same story, totally different approach to it. As always, savethebrave.org. I would love to you guys to do a monthly subscription and just pay $10, $15, $25. You hear me say it all the time. That's because it's important. We're out there trying to save lives and building and doing bigger and bigger things all the time. We're really going somewhere special. Help be part of it. Help us out. All right, enough of me talking. Let's let Vanessa talk for a little bit. Here comes Vanessa Otero.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Vanessa Otero with Adfontes Media, and you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
This is one of those shows that my former commander, Erik Kleinsmith, has asked me to do, and I love it. And it's so timely. We're talking with Vanessa, and one of the things that she does at adfontesmedia.com is they evaluate media sources. Gosh, given the headlines from the Baghdadi, killing the other day when we got that guy, some of the very questionable headlines make you wonder, like, who can we trust? Who can we read? And you can all look at adfontesmedia.com. I'll put that in the show notes, and you can see, like, the first thing they do is start laying down who's reliable, who does complex analysis well. All these things are in there. So, hey, first off, thanks for coming on. And Erik, thanks for setting this up. I'm going to get out of the way and let Erik kind of talk to you a little bit. Hey, this is P.J. Turner from the Break It Down Show, checking in real quick to ask you this. John, Scott, and I all support Save the Brave with our time, our location, our effort, and our money. Each month we give a small amount. Do the same with us. Go to savethebrave.org, click on the donate tab, pick an amount that you want to come out each month, and they will handle all the rest. I stand behind these folks. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the show. Kind of talk to you a little bit.
Oh, no problem. Then this is actually the first time I've talked to Vanessa, although we've been going back and forth on email and a couple other things well over a year.
Yeah.
And so just to give you a quick background on how I ran into her is that, my last tour active duty, Pete, after you and I were together, is I worked at part of the Army called the Land Information Warfare Activity. And it was all about the military getting into the information warfare business, including deception, psyops, public affairs, electronic warfare, jamming, all kinds of cyber warfare, everything. And after leaving the military, it was kind of like, well, okay, that's not the military thing. I'm going to put that behind me. And so, concentrated on doing a lot of intel stuff. But as I got to more and more working, doing the study, working training for the Army, and looking at different pieces, open source intelligence became incredibly important, and finding more and more that the I want to say the war, you can say it against information or war on information is leaving just the purview of the military and the government, and it's now seeping into every part of our life. And so there's more and more I'm finding myself questioning the veracity of sources, the truthfulness, the timing of it, not just the confirmation bias that is put out, or different kinds of biases and misperceptions. And so as I started doing research on this and writing several articles about fake news and when that all started and what fake news really means, and what is again, a very short definition is it's propaganda. I ran into this chart online created by Vanessa Otero, and I was totally blown away by it, because here's somebody who is not, from the intelligence community. It was not her, job for a commander or director or some agency to evaluate sources that intel folks have to do every day, all day.
Right.
And yet got it nailed on how to look at open sources that we're accustomed to every day, that we get 99% of our information from, and yet we still go to the same sources without understanding that there's an entirely different viewpoint, or there's stuff that's just out there that they're no longer there to inform, they're there to persuade, and that becomes a big piece. And so that's why I reached out to Vanessa directly, so I could include her chart in one of the articles that I wrote from my school at the American Military University. And I wrote it specifically on fake news as a guide for intelligence analysts on how to evaluate open sources. And I liked it so much, and she's been doing different versions of it, that I decided to include it in the book I got coming out on intelligence operations. Comes out December 2nd. And it's in the chapter about data and information and knowledge, and how those transform to each other, and how to take a look at the different sources that you're bringing in, whether it's classified or unclassified. But then this is a great chart to put in there, and this is an academic book, so it needs to be in there as a point of learning. And so that's why I reached out to Vanessa, and that's really because this is the first time I talked to her. I really wanted to get Vanessa, just throw a question out to you: is what started you along this path to put this together?
It was actually a hobby. I'm a really big nerd that analyzing the news is a hobby, but I'm a patent attorney by profession still. And in the run-up to the 2016 election, I was just sort of alarmed about the kind of news sources that people would share on social media, because, people would argue with each other, and often they'd post a link to support their viewpoint, but not realize that the link that they were posting was going to be completely unpersuasive to anybody except for people who already agreed with them,
Right.
because it'd be just highly biased or just very opinionated and polarizing. And that was just a lot of the stuff that people were sharing on social media. And you could the conversation about echo chambers and filter bubbles was coming to the surface around that time. And I thought, there's got to be a way to visually depict this, how there are some news sources that are better, some that are worse, some that are left and right, but there's different degrees and variations of how good or bad something is, and there's different reasons why, and there's things that can just be a little left or a little right, and they're fine opinions, but then there are things that are very extreme. So the media landscape is a complex thing, but as a patent attorney, part of my job is to take complex ideas and explain them in words and pictures. And 10,000 words can certainly convey an idea, but one picture or a couple of pictures can convey that sometimes much more easily. So I just put it together on my patent drawing software. I used Microsoft Visio for that. And I put it online and was shocked to see it go viral. And even more shocked that people from the academic community, journalism community, Intel community reached out and would ask me about my data and methodology and how I came up with this. And at first it was really just me, with my analysis and my own methodology in my head. But over time, over the last 3 years, I've put it out on paper and added more sources, come up with other versions. And within the last year, have incorporated other analysts with different political points of view to help me analyze much larger data set and do it in a much more streamlined and rigorous fashion. So now what we've got is the chart, this media bias chart, which is a two-dimensional taxonomy of how to categorize news. And we have a methodology for how we systematically place sources on that chart.
How much does a given news story from a cycle impact somebody? I mean, it looks like the AP and Reuters, like we would expect, are just right down the middle, reliable news. But, we have this whole impeachment story, and they're breaking a story about an Army colonel and all that. And it's like all of the news is in different directions. So does a story like this where, I don't know, let's just say the New York Times, because they're a standard bearer, does this story potentially move them to the left, to less reliable, up to more reliable in a significant fashion, or does it take more than one story to do that?
Well, for the sources that are on the chart right now, we've analyzed it usually at least 10 stories. It's not a huge sample, but for the bigger sources like Washington Post and New York Times, it's well over 75 stories each. And so it's much bigger sample. And that's kind of important because how people usually talk about the news and evaluating things like bias and opinion and credibility is usually on an ad hoc basis. They'll see an example that's a bad example, and they'll say, oh, see, this article from the New York Times is very left-leaning, it's very opinionated, therefore the whole news source is like that. And people will say that with things like Fox News too, because often your critics will view the worst things of the day that happen on Fox News. But if you actually look at our interactive media bias chart at adfontesmedia.com, you will see that we rank these on an article by article and show by show basis, which is super important. And our overall ranking is an aggregate weighted ranking of the articles that we ranked. So you'll see, the New York Times in exactly where that is, but then you'll see a bunch of dots that are a scatter plot showing that there are a bunch of stories that are fact-based and quite neutral, and then there are the left-leaning opinion stories, and there are right-leaning opinion columns as well. So it's an aggregate rating. But you mentioned at the beginning of the show this al-Baghdadi story, and that was really fascinating to look at across the spectrum. So we have this new practice that we do, which is that every week our analysts at Adfontes Media will rate 6 articles that are from across the spectrum about the same news story. And when we go and pick these, it's really, really fascinating. And this week we actually picked the al-Baghdadi reporting story because there's just a lot of things that you could focus on about that. And the coverage from left to right varied greatly. And the coverage from, low to high in terms of reliability very greatly as well. So, I mean, all the way on the left, you'd have stories that would say, actually, Trump messed this up and it was totally terrible. And he staged this photo op or whatever. And then on the right, it'll say, this is the best thing that's ever happened. This is even more important than bin Laden. And by the way, it makes all of the Democrats in the primary look like children, So there was such a huge difference in what you could focus on, what you could spin. And it really has a dramatic impact on our polarization as a society. If you're just reading stories from one of those extremes, it's really easy to just get locked in this world where, that's all you believe and that's the truth to you. Reading from across the spectrum is a great practice that I highly encourage, because you get to see how, different parts of the country, live and believe and react based on the content that they consume.
Well, one of the things, and again, just to describe this chart for listeners, you're looking at a two-dimensional graph, and it's really, once you line up all of these sources, they really kind of form a bell curve, so that the obviously the far left and the far right on either side, but then the up or down or the y-axis is rating them, these different news sources and individual stories for each source, based upon whether they're less reliable or more reliable in terms of original fact reporting, or it just contains complete fabrications or misleading content or things like that. And so that's what you get is, in the aggregate, is a bell curve of all the different sources. But even going further, there's so many possibilities for analysis that can be done, especially in my world, where just as, and I was just thinking about one, and Vanessa already mentioned, is that you can take a single story and then map where everyone is on that, where every different source came in on that one story, whether it's al-Baghdadi or whatever. And it harkens me back to when Pete and you and I were in Bosnia. We ran this newspaper called The Night Owl.
Oh, yeah.
Which was we had soldiers working it. We hired local Bosnian teenagers to come in, and we would just give them newspapers every day, and they would just translate these newspapers so that when the different commanders or whoever in the task force would come in the morning, they'd have this is what all the local papers are saying, but they'd have to form their own opinion on that. And so this is such a much more dynamic way. I mean, besides, we haven't got into bringing it into the classroom and how fantastic this could be for that. But the other piece then is you can take an event that occurred and just say, look, this is where everybody's tracking it. This is where the stories are coming in. And I know and I know, like, if you're just looking at it from a casual, I want to listen to the news, I don't want opinion or bias or anything like that. For intel folks, you want to go to those fringe parts. Those are incredibly important to look at, because you're still going to get just pieces of information that you're not going to get anywhere else. And the best example I have is when we were doing the Able Danger program, and we were hunting Al-Qaeda prior to 9/11. We were doing data mining, but we weren't really able. Internet wasn't really old enough for us to get overwhelmed with the amount of news sources. So we were bringing in stuff from bloggers and things like that. And we found a website that said that Al-Qaeda was operating in the Maghreb part of Africa or North Africa using a car dealership as a front organization to funnel money in and out of it. Great tip and cue for other information if we were able to corroborate that. But when we finally showed that to another agency, I don't want to mention any names, but its initials are FBI, that what they asked us, like, all right, what was your source for this? And we showed them the source, and it was this Michigan militia conspiracy theorist website that was absolutely spot on. They probably had no idea they were spot on this one story. But then they had all this other crazy stuff, like the FBI was sneaking the KGB into northern Michigan and arming them with caches of explosive and weapons. And Chelsea Clinton's real father was Webster Hubbell. I mean, it was just off the wall. And the FBI just dismissed the whole line that we were looking at because of the original source, even though we found all this other corroborating evidence that said, for whatever reason, these guys are nuts, but they were spot on in this one area. this chart helps you explain that and show your math much more easily. So I'm already giving you an ad for it. This is just the fantastic way to take a look at it. So
It's interesting that you mention a source that's typically very unreliable, but has a good actual real spot on story, and that's actually an insidious way that some of these very very poor reliability, highly polarizing sites often will use as a tactic on purpose. You said these guys didn't know that they had stumbled across something that was accurate, but it's the whole broken clock is right twice a day type of thing. And sometimes it's funny how people will take it, low quality sites will often take credit for outlandish predictions because they'll just publish anything. Like National Enquirer years ago got, they actually broke the John Edwards affair story, right?
That's right.
And they were like, "See, we're real news. Look at this real news that we broke." I mean, forget the 90% of the stuff that's just terrible. That because they have like no standards for
Elvis is living in Brazil next to Hitler and
exactly. But that happens on a more regular basis on things that are higher up on the chart, and that again is really insidious because I'll get very ardent defenders of InfoWars, which is so egregiously terrible that it has been kicked off of Facebook and Twitter, and you just have to be so terrible to get kicked off of those platforms. But even with all the stories of lizard people living on the moon and like the Sandy Hook being like fake, that horrible series of stories that they ran. People say, well, I know it's sometimes a little out there, but he has some good stuff too. And that tricks people when they have just enough. They're not 100% fake news. They have enough real stories to maintain some kind of credibility and some kind of plausibility. And those are the kinds of news sources that it's really important to rank on an article by article basis, because those are the ones that will radicalize people and like bring them further down the rabbit hole and take them even farther to the fringes. Because you can start with something that's just, on our chart, we have a skews left, skews right category. And then we have a hyper partisan left and right category. And then the most outside category is most extreme. It's the stuff in the hyper partisan categories that I think is most insidious and dangerous because it's the most polarizing, and it just kind of primes people to go down the rabbit hole and accept things that are more false than that.
Right. And part of the reason again is even though you see somebody, you'll see a story that is completely biased. The important piece from any kind of intel or security standpoint is you still need to read those, because those are the persuasive stories. Folks will listen to persuasion much easier than to listen to facts and make up their own minds. And why is because we just don't have enough time. Nobody. And I just had a discussion on Facebook with a friend of mine from high school. One of the things she put out was a story that she had blatantly took. She didn't do it on purpose. She just didn't know. And it was a blatantly biased article, and I think it was something about Mackinac Island and the use of automobiles, and the fact that I think the vice president had a motorcade on this island that normally you're not allowed to have a vehicle there. Well, that's just for security purposes. They got all kinds of reasons, and they never degrade their security. But the way the article was written was just way off base. And so in the discussions, the first thing she said was like, well, where can we go for an honest source? And my answer is really like, you can't. And you just people don't have the time to sit there and read their news and do it a skeptical, critical thinking of every piece. It's much easier to go to a place that and you understand, like, okay, I get this, I understand it, I believe it, and then just go on with their day. This model helps you to shatter that and helps you come up with a path that says, look, I need to look at these other areas. I intentionally need to go into some other areas that I'm not used to see what they're saying. And then even from an intel standpoint, is, especially if you're looking at foreign countries, that you got to look at the hyperbolic media, because that's what's driving the perception of whatever operation is taking place or whatever their viewpoint is of the U.S. involvement in, whatever. So that's why I say it's incredibly important to go out to those areas, even though you may totally disagree with what you're reading.
Yeah, and the question that people say, well, what news source can I go to and trust all the time? That's a tough one, because
Right.
people will say, if you give them an example of a reputable news source, and it doesn't matter who it is, NPR, AP, Reuters, Washington Post, LA Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal,
Mhm.
everyone can give an example of a time that one of those sources messed up. And people will easily just throw their hands up in the air and say, well, then I can't trust anybody. And that's not true. Because what we can rely on is, especially in the United States, we're fortunate to have this because we have freedom of the press, is that we can rely on the media ecosystem. We have a very robust media ecosystem. And the reason we find out and we know that sources make mistakes is because these reputable sources first will admit when they find out they make a mistake, or when somebody else finds out they make a
Right.
mistake. And their peers in the industry have incentives to point out the mistakes of others. They have incentive to go and say, try to re-verify something that another outlet broke, because if they find out that wasn't true, they've got a big scoop, right?
Right.
So, and then they'll rush to print it, and that's one way in which they compete with each other. So if there's a story that you're unsure about, you can easily read across 6 to 8 very reputable publications and come to a pretty good sense of what the truth is. But reading across the spectrum is not only important for those very reputable sources. It is, like you say, really important to look at what's going on in the lower quality and the fringes. And so the exercise that I told you about that our analysts do every single week. So this week it was about al-Baghdadi stories. Last week it was about a story where the California Governor Gavin Newsom, he pardoned 3 immigrants who had criminal records, because it was going to help in their deportation cases, because they were from a long time ago. And, you can imagine there was a lot of different political takes on that one.
Mhm.
The week before, it was about the CNN LGBT town hall for the Democratic primary candidates. The reason that we do that, one of the reasons we do that, is because we now have a media literacy software platform that we just launched and make available to students in classrooms, where they can evaluate those same news articles that we pick and compare them to our analysts' ratings. So they can go through the process of reading across the spectrum, go through the methodology of how we actually rank these sources on our chart, and learn those critical thinking skills themselves.
So when you guys are working your chart, there's many of you to kind of check each other. You have a sense for, I'm middle right, I'm middle left, whatever it is. But then you actually get in there and start analyzing things. Do you find out what your sense of your sense of position is? Does it change? Does it evolve? Are you able to accurately do that and then wait for your bias at all, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we have a couple of ways of measuring that. When we first started, we had everyone fill out these self-rating spreadsheets to evaluate their own political leanings. And, people's political leanings are complex. It's not just left and right. I mean, people have different nuanced views on different political issues, and especially people who are very, politically involved and astute. So we broke it down into 20 issues and had people rank themselves from, most extreme left to most extreme right on those, and then come up with an overall aggregate rating.
Hey, this is P.A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Aggregate rating. We balanced our groups based on that, on what people's self-rating, what their self-rating was. in terms of, were they very left, very right, somewhat left, somewhat right, or some version of center. And after the fact, we also did some additional analysis to make sure we adjusted for if people were consistently rating things on their side as higher reliability as compared to the average over time. Because you can see that, right? Like if you're right leaning and you read something that's right leaning, you just tend to give it more credibility. And if you're left leaning, you read something left leaning, then you give it more credibility. But what was interesting when we first did this on a large scale over this past summer was that we found that on an article by article basis, the deviations between a left leaning person and a right leaning person were really not that much. I mean, they're usually within one category of each other. So, and it makes sense if you think about it. Like, if you get really general, like you want to say, CNN is terrible or Fox News is terrible. I mean, CNN and Fox News are these enormous organizations that put out just hours and hours and millions of words of content every day. So to talk about it on that high general level is difficult. But if you point two people of different political leanings to the same article, say you're looking at a very left-leaning opinion article. A person on the left can look at that and say, this is left-leaning opinion. A person on the right will also look at that and say, this is left-leaning opinion. They'll agree to a very high degree of certainty, which is amazing. And that's why we break it down on an article by article basis.
And then what's news and what's opinion? I mean, obviously an editorial piece is opinion, but a lot of times people write news about news.
Right. That's, I think, the most important distinction in our taxonomy, because people, they'll put it in this binary of news versus opinion, and it's more complex than that. So we have a 1 to 5 scale of fact, analysis, and opinion. So I know those are 3 things, but we go, so 1 would be fact. Something's rated as a factual statement, just stated as fact, expressed as fact. 2 would be it's expressed as fact with some analysis. So analysis, what we're talking about analysis here is conclusions. Now, 3 on our scale would be analysis. So it would be tying facts to conclusions. And then 4 would be analysis with opinion. Then 5 would be opinion. So the difference being that at the very bottom, your opinions are just conclusions without that are not very well tied to facts and are generally disputed, right? Like if you say something like, government corruption is absolute. Well, is that true or false? I mean, you can make lots of cases for it. That's kind of disputable, right? But it's a conclusion, and it's not tied to any facts. But if you wanted to make a case that like there's a lot of government corruption in whatever country, you could make that into analysis. It'd be ranked higher by laying out a fact, and then a conclusion, right? So if you have an article about something that just happened, it's like who, what, when, where, why story. There was a fire, for example. Like this is where the fire is happening in what part of California, and this is where it was reported to be started, and this is how much it has been contained, and this is what the weather is going to be like tomorrow. That's just a list of facts. So that would be ranked 1 in our as far as expression. But then the things that move it down the scale from fact to analysis and opinion is the degree to which the facts are prominent in the article. The more opinionated pieces will just be more conclusory and less tied to facts. And the analysis stuff in the middle will be, have a balance of facts with conclusions that are supported by those facts. So, it's really a gradient. And people are not used to evaluating news on that gradient. They're just, they kind of have this, binary, this dichotomy of news versus opinion, where it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Have you run across? I mean, I mean, you've been doing this for quite a while, but have you run across a given story that was just kind of, I guess, really surprising of how it laid out with the different sources? If you've been doing this week by week.
One thing that's surprising is that when you based on the topic, you won't get coverage in some quarters on certain things. So, for example, this story about Gavin Newsom pardoning immigrants because of so they were less likely to be deported in their deportation hearings. I looked across the spectrum. Then this wasn't a huge story, granted, nationwide, but it was reported by like AP and Politico, and those were fairly neutral treatments of it. But it was really picked up a lot in right leaning media,
Right.
and like Fox actually treated it quite fairly. So it skewed right, but it was still quite fair and factually based. But then there were a few outlets just on the lower right quadrant that really picked it up and were like, using it to like kind of incite anger about immigrants. But there were no corresponding articles on the bottom left saying, you know what, this is the greatest thing ever that Gavin Newsom has ever done, and we should pardon more crimes, right? There wasn't like that. There wasn't that extreme trade-off.
Right.
And so, the coverage gaps are the most surprising.
I think what you're touching on is another form of bias, and it's bias by omission.
Absolutely.
Where and that's part, it's something to consider. Is like if you got something that's not favorable to your viewpoint of the world, then and this is, it happens in the larger organizations because you may be a hot reporter that's doing all the research on this, and it gets up to the editor, and the editor goes, "That's not newsworthy." Well, why? I think it is. Like, no, not to me. And that's just how it works. So you eat from the I want to say from the smaller blogosphere, and the more, I want to say, fast and loose types of news organizations that are, or even the aggregate sites that are putting stuff up there. Yeah, you'll see some of the bias by omission, but it's still present in the larger ones. Like we're just not going to cover this. Why? Because it makes our guy look bad. I mean, nobody's going to say that, but that's just the way it is. So it's just, I mean, I'm amazed. That's interesting that, again, this chart can pick that out, and you could probably quantify that along the lines in the same manner.
Yeah, I mean, bias by omission is a huge thing, and that's kind of why this is hard to measure, because if you're trying to measure what's not in a paper or an article, you have to know what should be in it, and you have to read other sources to find that out.
Some of this stuff, so I mean, looking at this like an intel guy who's going to be on the ground and be a reporter, right? Like my unique access is, my job is to get things you can't find out otherwise. And so I write a report. It's like writing the news. And when I read other people's reports, I can see the holes, even if I'm not on their patrol, I can see the holes in their story because of things they've missed, right? Because it's really easy to ask the wrong questions in the wrong sequence. And, if they start to spin things, a lot of adverbs start showing up and a lot more adjectives that aren't really necessary. Like, an intel report should be pretty simple language so that anybody can pick it up and read it and understand it. So at least by my style, short sentences and that kind of thing. But do you get a sense for that too, where you see like this person just isn't competent enough to be doing this, complex story or presenting this thing? They just don't have the chops to get the information out.
Yeah, I mean, when you look into the analysis opinion market of news, right now that floods our media landscape at the moment. It's really expensive to produce good journalism because you have to pay people to be on the ground finding it out and talking to primary sources and digging through documents and then writing it up and editing it and fact checking it. I mean, there's so much that goes on with real journalism, but it's really easy to put up an analysis and opinion website, right? Mm-hmm. And you can have 5 staffers or 12 staffers and who are just writers that are writing opinion and analysis and just writing about the news. Like you said before, they're writing news, but it's about the news. And that's cheaper to produce. And one of the ways that they're incentivized to drive engagement is by using the things that you mentioned, like adjectives and adverbs, and you're making them more into opinion pieces because those are the things that are more polarizing. Those are the things that drive clicks and views. And so, unfortunately, we've got so much of this what I call junk news. And I mean, there's some opinion and analysis that's very worthwhile. It helps us understand our world. I mean, you look at places like the Guardian, the Atlantic, Economist. There are some really great analysis that are important. However, there's so much more of it that's just analysis, and you see this. I think the cable news channels are the most guilty of this because they have these incredible resources to actually, they could be sending reporters across the world and have them be on the ground reporting things that we would never otherwise hear about because they have 24 hours to fill on our TVs. But what do they do instead? You can watch CNN for 6 hours and hear about four stories. Like one will be like the weather event of the day, the hurricane or the fire, and then 3 things Trump did today, and then they'll have 10 people talking about their opinion about what that means. And I mean, you don't hear that much actual news. You just hear all this opinion and analysis, and I think that really is kind of rotting our collective brains. It's I call it junk news because like junk food.
I totally agree.
Junk food is like, it's food. It won't kill you right away, but it's not good for you to just sit there all day. And I feel like consuming all the cable news is the information equivalent of eating donuts and fries all day.
Do you guys have a layer that looks at individual reporters and then how they skew?
We don't categorize it by journalists and reporters, and we do that purposely because you can get at the same thing that you're looking for by analyzing the content. So it's like grading the paper rather than grading the student, because even somebody who's you typically view them, like you may be familiar with a opinion writer in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times and say, oh, this person is conservative, or oh, this person is liberal, but they may, a particular piece of work can't stand on its own, and it may not necessarily take a hardline conservative or hardline liberal position that you would expect from that writer. So yeah, you could look at their body of work over time and say 90% of this stuff leans left, but then this 10% is center or maybe even more conservative on this issue. And I think that's more instructive. Also, it gets very personal, and people are more complex. So just to label them and put them in buckets would just invite more controversy, anyways.
Yeah, that's fair. Now, I can see that being the case where you reduce the value of what you do by doing that. And then what about flipping this around and you guys creating your own news source, like saying this is an aggregator of things that we find to be reliable, or here are the left-leaning or right-leaning things?
Yeah, there are lots of folks that are in the aggregation business, and there are folks that already rely on our chart as kind of a basis for that. So we've got our work cut out for us to try to analyze all the content in the world. So we won't do that.
It's a lot. What about folks who are, look, in some ways, my show is a news outlet. We definitely break news here, and we give ground truth to things that, like I've got potentially have a very, very high placed person in the Kurdish government going to come on the show and talk about Kurdistan, right? But I'm not a news source. So how does something like, because Tim Pool, I didn't see his name on there. He talks about the news all day long. How about people like that are sort of tertiary sources?
Yeah, so we focus on some of the bigger ones. There are certainly smaller outlets, smaller blogs that are that have made it on our chart just because they do have some extensive Twitter followers or Facebook pages or things like that. And so you can see that it easily gets into these kind of as you say, tertiary sources. The point of creating this taxonomy and methodology is so that ultimately we are able to rate any kind of content, any kind of content that touches on news, but you can, especially political news. People ask us to rate things like Rolling Stone and Teen Vogue, which certainly have columns and content that are political, but most of it is directed towards music or fashion in those examples, right? So we can rate all the content. We plan on rating as much of it as possible, but we do want to focus on the things that people come to rely on as sources of news. Examples of that include things like PragerU on YouTube, other prominent YouTubers, sites on prominent Facebook pages. People rely on for news. We want to be able to rate all of those because people have a hard time distinguishing between what's reliable for news and what's not. Right. And that's the whole question that our chart answers. And so, especially on Facebook, where lots of different sites will show up with that news card. What it looks like. It's very familiar. It's a familiar format. It's a picture. Mm-hmm. It's the title of the outlet, and it's the title of the article. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if it is New York Times or trutheagle.gun, right? That was a joke on SNL the other day. That's not a real website, but they made a joke about that on SNL. Those show up as the same news card, So if people can't distinguish that, that's the kind of stuff that we want to be able to distinguish. I mean, we can get into podcasts and radio shows and things like that. Anything that people rely on as a news source, we don't rate it all yet, but we plan to.
How does Saturday Night Live, how do they rate? They have news of sorts, or is it all parody?
Right. So, satire and humor is a really interesting thing. So we've avoided it sort of purposely on our chart up to this point. To the extent that people rely on it for news, I just said, we want to rate everything that people rely on for news. It would rank really low on our on our scale, as would any humorous outlet, right?
Right.
And it's not that these are not valuable. Satire, comedy, you focus on the political issues of the day, speaking truth to power. Making fun of people who are in power. That's just a long-standing American tradition. It's a hallmark of democracy. It's super important. It's also very funny, right? But is it news? No. I think even Michael Che on SNL said that a few weeks ago. He said that people would come up to him and say, "Oh man, I rely on you to get all my news," and he says, "Don't do that." Because you shouldn't. It's very selective. I mean, they only cover a couple of things. Yeah. Same thing with the Daily Show or Stephen Colbert. You're not going to find out the day's news if you watch that. You'll find out some things that are going on, but it's certainly not sufficient. The whole point of those things is to poke fun and to make you laugh. So there's going to be unfairness in there. You'll notice here's the format of most comedy. They'll say things like Mitch McConnell, comma, some insult about Mitch McConnell, right? To get a laugh, and then move on to what he did. That's just the format of those things. So, it's as far as newsworthiness, that's pretty unfair, right?
Yeah.
So I guess in that sense, have you received any pushback from some of these news organizations that are not happy where they are on your chart?
Yes.
Ooh.
I can't imagine. I can't imagine anybody's going to take it. Well, I'm not taking that lying down. We're going to do something about it or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've gotten some good complaints from both bottom corners of the chart, which is very flattering.
Except the National Enquirer. I'm sure they're okay with that.
Yeah, I haven't heard from them.
Nope, we're okay.
So InfoWars, this is just the highest form of flattery. The very first chart I came out with, InfoWars has always, been the bottom right dweller of my chart for a good reason. Everybody kind of knows about them. A couple of days later, they came out with their own chart, and the axes were something like freedom and tyranny and like corporatist versus something else.
Wow.
And of course, they were at the apex of whatever that chart was. And there are some other sources that are scattered. There was like 8 other things. And then I think they gave up because, charts are hard to make. So they obviously I was a mainstream media propaganda machine or something of that sort. And but I've gotten complaints from folks on the bottom left. Lots of Twitter rants. Their defenders, coming after me saying like, you just don't get it, and this is funny, and or this guy is telling the truth, and he got this one story right this one time. But I think the people that are in the bottom corners, they kind of know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it's a business model.
Right.
They're taking advantage of people who are gullible, and they're monetizing it. And I think that's wrong. And so I don't mind receiving their criticism. I do appreciate the sources that I've heard from that are in the top of the chart that kind of want to understand why they're a little bit more left or right than they perceive themselves to be, and they kind of want to understand the reason for their ranking in comparison to others. And that's useful because the media industry itself is under constant pressure to change. And, they have these competing pressures of, putting out a good product, a good newsworthy, high quality journalism product, and, also having the challenges of making money in this evolving news industry. So, they need to understand what, how their content is perceived as well.
Now, and then on the flip side of that, have you received any feedback of somebody who is, maybe even somebody that's helping you work on the chart, that has either changed, that this chart looking at is like, I really need to change how I look at my news, or it's changed their ideology that says, based upon this, I've went to the other side, I've looked at it, and now I'm seeing things that I've not seen before. Have you got any feedback in more of a positive way?
Like from my analysts
or from anybody.
People that are, I do get a lot of great feedback that is really gratifying to me. People tell me that, okay, now I just stick to sources that are in the green box. The green box would be like the top middle section of my chart. And I think that's a positive outcome because, they're purposely screening their own news feeds and trying to be in less of an echo chamber. I've had other people that say, I purposely go to sites that I was not familiar with before, and now I understand my political opponents better. Right. I think that so people don't tend to admit readily when they change their mind or flip a side completely, because there's just a lot of personal ego risk. Right. Yes, exactly. However, people, when people say, "Oh, you can't change anybody's mind," that's absolutely false. Like, these media sources and we as humans are in the business of changing other people's minds and influencing them all the time. Right. It's maybe a gradual thing that people change their minds over time, but how I see it manifest in the most rewarding way is when people say that they now understand and can have a conversation with somebody who's on the other side. I think that's the most critical thing that you can get, most critical benefit. Because if you understand, what arguments somebody's going to make before they make them and why they think that way based on the news that they read, then it's, when you first hear it come out of their mouth, you're not shocked or angry or upset. You just kind of know where they're coming from, and you can address it. It's
kind of the effect social media has had, is, you see so many, arguments on social media is because somebody puts something up inflammatory, and it's just, there's no really way to back it up or whatever. It's just like, what is this? This is garbage. I can't believe my friend is doing this. He must be crazy.
He must be crazy, yeah. But
exactly.
But your friend has read 8 different things that say all the same thing,
right?
And in his world, that's not crazy at all.
Exactly. I mean, that's it. I've never dropped it. I mean, I have several folks that are on the different part of the spectrum that I am that I've kept. In fact, Pete and I know several of them together. But it's like I've only dropped folks that have just been it's not really what they've put out. They've just been belligerent, and
Mm-hmm.
that's different than putting out a story. But that's, but again, that is, if you take a look at where they're coming from, that's why I keep saying is like, if I had this as an intel analyst, especially doing information warfare, this is such an invaluable tool to use this to evaluate sources as they're coming in, especially if I got to brief a commander or something like that, is to be able to show the landscape. Like, and it's not just, I mean, this is primarily U.S. media. You could
Mm-hmm.
build this chart on foreign media, and that's really what the job of a lot of intel folks is like. Look, we need to get the entire landscape of everything going on in the Middle
Mm-hmm.
East, even non-English speaking stuff, and place these on the same chart so we have an understanding that, and we can brief this and show our math to our commanders who have to make decisions based upon this. You're doing, you're breaking ground by showing this model, and that's why I'm just total fan on this should get more coverage in the mainstream media and also in the market space.
No, I appreciate that. We actually have individuals from across the world who are trying to create these charts for their own countries, and it's totally possible. You just need to set the left-right the left-right spectrum for this U.S. chart is the U.S. left-right spectrum. So you need to
Right.
reset it for different countries based on people who are local and understand the local politics there. But it's absolutely possible. And I think that has huge applications. You can imagine the left-right spectrum for France would look different from the left-right spectrum in Saudi Arabia. And so, like, if you just put all these individual country charts together, you could kind of layer them on top of each other and make this chart of charts for the world.
Right. I mean, that's one of one of the reasons why it's important is you want to be able to you're going into different parts of the world, especially with U.S. natural interest. And it's so great that, I hate to say this, but it's so great that this is not an academic-based chart because you made it simple enough to be recreated, which is, again, the simplicity is in itself. There's not a lot of thought process, so then therefore it is much easier to explain this to somebody who you have to brief instead of starting going into formulas and algorithms and things like that. That's again one of the beauties of it. Is I don't know how many times I've seen studies from academics that say, "Hey, this is great. Can you use this?" And it's like, no. Why? Because I can't take the 1919 Armenian genocide, this formula you came up to understand it, and use that on any other thing in the world. This allows you to do that.
Right. And, people want to understand, people who are interested in media bias and quality, you can read lots of really great papers on it, but the problem is that most people who need to know about media bias and quality the most are not going to be the folks that read those academic papers.
Right.
One of the things also with being intel and reporting and how they work together, I can go on the same patrol as somebody else and see totally different realities. Mm-hmm. And so it's legitimate that you could have a reporter from publication X and one from publication Y, and they come back with a totally different experience, based completely on their own observations, their analysis, whatever, that's subject to review. But it's important that you're doing this because you can look, the whole situation in Syria and Kurdistan and Turkey and all that is so complex. All you can report is like the tip of a pin compared to like the global reality that is, because Turkey has a say, Syria has a say, the Kurds everybody has a say, and you're trying to guess as to what's really happening on the ground. It's impossible to cover in 500 words. There's just no way to do it.
Right. Yeah, and that's the crazy part. I mean, when we try to...
You don't have to comment on Syria because it's just so complex. I can't imagine you guys, want to
still
deal
unfolding.
Say it again.
It's still unfolding.
It's still unfolding, and there's no good answer. It's hard to analyze something it's like analyzing a point in a river. It's changing every instant.
Right.
What's next for you guys over there? I mean, obviously you're growing. You've got this great product. What's coming up the next year or two?
Well, like I said, we just launched our media literacy software platform for educators, and we're really hopeful that it becomes a part of media literacy curriculums across the country. Media literacy curriculums are not a very common thing. There are high schools and colleges that are in process developing these types of courses because it is so important. But mostly it's social studies and English language teachers that are trying to incorporate it into their curriculums right now, because it's, information literacy is just such an important part of being able to understand the world around you. I feel like we're in this temporary moment where our ability as a society to spread information has temporarily outstripped our ability to process it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's happened before in history, like with the printing press and when radio came out and things like that. And we learned to adapt, right? But we had to get smarter. And right now we're kind of functionally media illiterate as a society. Can't tell what's left and right. Can't tell what's good and bad. A huge chunk of the population. So I believe that because entire societies have gone from illiterate to literate in just a span of a generation or two, because reading is taught, we can go from media illiterate to media literate in a generation, as long as we teach young people how to read the news. So that's a huge part of what we're up to right now. I really hope that people start using our content analysis strategy and methodology as just a functional way of teaching students how to evaluate content, because they need to not just have examples of like, oh, here's a fake news story and here's a deep fake video, here's examples, this is why this is bad. They should be able to handle any kind of content that comes at them, because then they'll truly be prepared. And can you imagine having a society where there's just low demand for junk news? Like, that's what it would actually change things, right?
Yeah. That would be great.
We ultimately want to help. There's a lot of different ways in which the analysis and the ranking of news can impact society. I mean, when Google first came out, the basic idea was we're going to organize the world's information. Well, we're going to rate the world's news, and I think that's going to be a very obvious thing that this was needed. When we look back 5 years from now, like, of course we needed to rate the news and rank the news. So that's what we're trying to do. And there are ways that publishers themselves can use that in kind of ranking information. Companies who advertise on news sources can use that information to make sure that they're supporting good journalism and avoiding junk news and fake news and propaganda. So we hope to be able to help all the stakeholders in good news media, so we can get to that promised land of where there's just less fake news out there, because none of us have an appetite for it.
Yeah, please do that. Please accomplish that incredible goal. That would be fantastic.
I'm working on it.
Thank you so much. Erik, any last questions?
No, I think this is great. I'm so happy to bring her to you and to get her on your show, because this is the type of thing that needs more exposure. I mean, quite honestly.
That's right. And hopefully I have a vertical for you, Vanessa. It's I pay a subscription each month and you put me on your chart, and then I throw a fit, and then everybody's drawn to your chart and they're drawn to my show, and we all benefit. We'll sell subscriptions to it.
See, now she's going to be accused of that. So just.
That's one business model.
Yeah.
Oh, no good. Well, listen, seriously, all kidding aside, I really do love what you're doing, and I appreciate Erik bringing you in, because just this past week, I'm like, forget the damn news. None of it's worth anything. But it is worth doing. And, if you want to be on top of a story, you're going to have to do some work and read some stuff you don't want to read. And I appreciate you guys for giving us our bell curve and helping to continue to get smarter on that, so I can read news better.
I'm just happy to finally meet Vanessa. So that's great.
Yeah, it's great to meet you too. It was great talking to you guys. I really appreciate this very in-depth conversation. Love talking about this stuff, and I'm glad you care about it too. So thank you.